Hi, my
The
name is
commercial.
Richard. This is Aaron. We're both incredibly poor people, as you can tell from our shabby clothing and the rest of it. But Zoom, Meetup, YouTube do require fees to maintain premium accounts, and so therefore, if you like the content that Aaron and I are about to provide you, and any other content that you've seen from us at History Mostly Ancient discussions, please provide us PayPal donations. They go directly towards the maintenance of the channel. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can see that below. You can use that to see all the other episodes in the European Union series or any other series that this channel produces.
And
And
it's
of
over
course,
400, I think it's 440 different episodes at this point, right?
yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Covering things as disparate as the Roman Empire, ancient Egypt, the Iron Age, the
This
conquest
little
of the
Series
Americas
you
by
did on
Hernan
Middle
Cortés.
East and North Africa.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I don't want to toot my own horn, and when it's your time to shine. So,
It's okay.
this
You've only
this
done
is
about 70 episodes on Middle East, North Africa.
so. These are our ongoing series. Of course, you can see European Union security as fourth on that list, but you have my series, The MENA History, every Thursday night. Greco-Roman civilization is on and off on Saturdays usually. Asian philosophy and Greco-Roman philosophy. Asian philosophy is continuing every Saturday night. Greco-Roman philosophy, I believe, is on hiatus. Powerful Women, we have an episode coming up from Jane in mid-November. In that series, John Maloney just did his Ugaritic episode. And of course, we have our short run series like the Russo-Ukrainian War series that we do sort of every 3 months or so at this point. So, Aaron, take me through some of these changes you want to outline.
Yeah. So I think what's important is that, when we think of this conflict now in Ukraine, and we're 9 months in really at this point. So, 200 and almost 57 days, I guess, is that there's really this parallel political dimension to this, which was always there, but is as the different phases, seasons, as the ultimately sort of the reloading of the conflict on both sides occurs. I think it's really important to not lose sight of all the different actors involved, right? So
wait, I just want to take a second. Can you talk a little bit about this reloading? Like,
yeah,
why are we talking about fatigue on part of the actors to continue supplying? Are we talking about the onset of winter? What's causing the reload?
well, yeah. So I mean, I would say the first things that's causing it is the incredible use of armaments, first and foremost. I mean, so when you compare this conflict really to any other in the last 30 years, at least, I would argue really since, objectively, maybe since the Vietnam War with the US, you really haven't had a kinetic conflict at this scale with the enormous amount of armaments. I mean, we're talking about not just small arms, right? Which the majority of conflicts in the world are conducted with small arms. Small arms meaning rifles,
AK-47s.
AK-47s, squad and small unit armaments, machine guns, up to anything that's sort of person mobile that 2-4 people could carry around. Maybe small mounted weapons like 12.7 millimeter, which you've seen in movies. They're called technicals, which is you take a Toyota Helix truck and you basically mount
A rocket
large
launcher
machine
on the
gun
top
on
of
it,
that, yeah.
or exactly, rocket launchers, etc. That's sort of about as high order that you would get. I mean, you would have some conflicts where you'd see sort of like a rando tank or a rando set of armored personnel carriers, but that would be about it. This conflict is completely different. I mean, at 9 months, I mean, I think the closest proximity to this conflict, from being sort of objective about it, is really the Korean War at this point. I mean, the amount of astronomical amount of forces that are being allied against each other, and because of modern warfare. And when I say modern, I don't mean modern in the last 150 years. I mean modern, in, let's say, in the last 25 I'd say 25 to 50 years. An individual or a small group can really apply the kinetic force, the power of maybe a unit 3 to 5 times its size 50, 75 years ago. So
wait, can you pause on that for a second? Because that's
Sure.
something that I think that might be interesting to discuss.
Yeah.
How is it that individuals can apply this kind of kinetic force that
Sure.
would require tanks and other mobilized infantry and other sorts of much larger gear in the past?
Yeah.
What are they
So,
doing?
I mean, if you take it down to sort of the simple individual soldier, if you take the simple individual soldier today, just their basic kit that they'll have, they'll carry minimum 300 rounds, and many times, if it's more an urban dense area, it might be closer to 500 or 600 or 700 rounds. And the more urban your fighting is, the more firepower you use, right? Just because you have more fixed emplacements, more structures. There tends to be, sort of more of a sort of a brute force approach the more urban you are, and or what's technically called built up areas. So built up fighting tends to use more weapons, more ammunition. The soldiers themselves carry them more. We're bigger as people, human beings, so we carry more than we were 75, 100 years ago. You look at the average height of a Russian or German or Japanese or American male in 1943, and their weight, and you look at one today, it's 75 years later, it's substantially different. It's 4, 5, 6 inches taller, 50, 75 pounds heavier. I mean, so you have a very different animal, and I mean that in literal but also figurative terms. And then you have a modernization of that firepower. And so that individual soldier carrying that, also what you might have as a heavy machine gun 50 or 75 years ago, which would be carried and maintained by 2 or 3 people. You now have basically individual soldier versions of those machine guns. In the US or in the NATO, that's called, like, an example being a SAW, squad assault weapon, which is an individual fire weapon, but it fires like a heavier machine gun. So you might have 2 or 3 of those in a squad of 8 or 9. And then you will have maybe one of those heavier machine guns that you would have had in the past at a platoon level, which might be 30 people, 35 people, that might now be in a group of 15. So when you look at the kinetic firepower of just 30 people, just on an individual soldier level firing capability, it's easily 5 times greater.
So
I mean, that's
pivoting back,
easily.
yeah.
Yeah.
So pivoting
And
back
then
to
we
the
haven't,
reload.
by the way, a quick point, I haven't layered any of the other firepower that you have, which is orders of magnitude greater. So the reason that all matters is you add up today, 300,000 Ukrainians fighting and 250,000 Russians fighting. It looks a hell of a lot like a million people fighting on each side, 50, 75 years ago, if not millions on each side.
Wow. So again, let's go back to the reload. So what's causing the reload?
Well, once the initial 2-week invasion failed by the Russians and the Ukrainians were able to organize a defense and counter that defense, or provide enough counter attack of that invasion, and be able to establish a sustained line of defenses over the first month and a half, and really kind of withstand everything the Russians had for their initial invasion. What the Russians did is they pivoted to, their god of war, which is firepower and artillery, which they proceeded to unload, millions, at least, probably several million, if not 5 million artillery rounds on Ukrainian positions. And the Ukrainians were able to dig in, withstand. They took some fairly devastating losses, but they were able to get sustained through that. And then when the West fully armed the Ukrainians and were able to really begin large scale training of the Ukrainians, which was really in the spring, then the Ukrainians were able to punch back by the summer. And so, you now have, if any of you have any sort of history of sports analogies in your lives, this is any kind of battle royal you want to have, whether it's the Ali versus Frazier in boxing, Real Madrid versus Barcelona when Barcelona was good, et cetera. You have a sort of not a superpower in the sense of U.S. Soviet fighting, but you have sort of a regional version of that occurring on the ground. And the Russians, of course, have just reloaded their, logistics and supplies to continually, bring the fight, to the Ukrainians and attempt to remobilize, while the Ukrainians are getting all of their Western armaments, and separate the armaments from the logistical ammunition stocks and stores, right? Because they really are two separate things. The Ukrainians have had to acquire all of these heavy armaments first and get trained on them, and then obviously they have to get acquire all those logistical stores. And you're forced ultimately at some point to make a calculus decision on where you want to engage the Russians. And when you do that, you're either trying to engage them in a place where they don't have a lot of firepower, so that you can maneuver and acquire that space, which the Ukrainians have had at least one big offensive to do that effectively and a few smaller ones, or, which is more often the case, they have to counter fire with fire, maybe a little more strategic, maybe a little more surgical, but it still is volumes of fire. You're not countering 50,000 artillery shells with 200 a day, right? That's not going to be effective. So does that make sense, just in terms of the scale of these reloads on the stocks and stores?
Absolutely. No, one thing I wanted to say is that people who are watching, please put your comments in the chat. I will read the chat and ask those questions of Aaron as we move through. This slide looks to be about peace proposals and peace considerations. You want to talk through some of the
so there's a whole bunch of groups in parallel, primarily in the West and in the adjacent West, or we'll call it the neutral, non-aligned West, who, for various reasons, political, philosophical, the way they engage. If it's Ireland, right? Ireland is not an expeditionary state, right? They don't really have a standing army. So they tend to act, at least internationally, as almost a parallel diplomatic corps. And there's groups like the Elders, you can look them up, which are various groups that are attempting to, quote unquote, bring together both sides or multiple sides to start having what those groups feel should be happening, which is some parallel discourse on peace. Now, I think most parties believe that's somewhat naive at this point, but B, typically you don't find large kinetic powers just switching to the peace talks unless there's a change on the battlefield. I don't think that's a very novel, advanced graduate, international relations thinking there. And so, most parties, either because of their, moral or political sort of philosophical belief, or I would say because they have economic interests. That's where I brought up, that's why I put in the Elon Musk sort of, I call it, lean startup drive-bys, right? So you get a lot of sort of people with, who probably haven't read much IR because they think it's fluffy or it's just a bunch of nonsense. And then they stick themselves into, complex international conflicts and think, they can make a difference. And in some cases they have. I mean, to be very blunt, without the Starlink communications capability, the Ukrainian defense would have had significant challenges the last 6 to 8 months. I mean, there's just no way around that. I mean, I think the Starlink was absolutely strategic to that, which gave Musk, I think a little bit of oxygen and capital to go in with a whole bunch of other strange proposals that don't make any sense. And ultimately, he fell back to sticking to funding Starlink and the status quo ante. And I don't think we'll hear much about his peace proposals. But there's a bunch of other parties, and some of this has to do with obviously the knock-on effects of the war, right? As you move past this first few months of the war, now into 6-9 months and eventually to a year, it's pretty clear you're not going to have any substantial breakthroughs in any short periods of time, unless you have a complete collapse on the Russian side, which I just don't. I mean, nothing in the cards looks like that's happening. If anything, there's a significant re-emphasis of protecting, especially the southern part of Ukraine and Crimea for Russian forces going through the spring of next year, that you're dealing now with some permanent effects, right? When it comes to food supply, when it comes to energy, so ag, energy, minerals, the sanction effects, and the knock-on all over the world is becoming substantial. And especially in places of the world where they had huge dependencies on either Russian, Ukrainian agricultural products, mineral trade, whether bidirectional, or energy for that matter, or individual dependencies they might have had on Russia. And because of the sanctions, which the sanction regime on Russia is the most comprehensive. I mean, you could argue you could take every other sanction regime in human history, and since at least World War II, since we've had the modern sanction regime, kind of bundle them together. And this sanction regime is starting to approach that. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And if you think about it, we've stayed very much at the state sanctions level at this point, right? We have not, and state and entity sanction level, we have not actually personalized the sanctions too much so far. Maybe a few dozen to 100 or a few hundred people. But if we in the West, really double down on the personalization of sanctions, where you're targeting, the top, let's say, several 100,000 people in the Russian regime and its ecosystem. I mean, this would be the most comprehensive sanctions that we've ever had. So I think a whole bunch of outside states, especially non-aligned ones, are getting a lot of blowback in their own populations, their own companies, because their societies or their businesses are very dependent on everything going on in this conflict. And it's pretty clear that you're not going to have a knockout blow phase of this conflict for quite a while, if you do.
Now, one thing I noticed from this is that it lists that Armenia and Azerbaijan are working towards a peace treaty. Can you sort of work through why the Ukraine conflict would cause those two enemies to come a little closer?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this has more to do with that they're proxies for Turkey and Russia. So what's I think a less observed effect right now is Turkey has dramatically increased its soft power in the last 9 months as party to this conflict, right? They're acting as the ombudsman, the traffic cop for shipping. Really, arguably, they'll be the protectorate at a certain point. If you don't already have, you will have, Turkish captains, co-captains that will be navigating vessels, which will allow, obviously, for a substantial neutrality of everything moving through the Bosphorus. This is sort of one of the great gifts that the Russians have given Turkey, which Turkey, as you know, through your series, has been trying to achieve for 500 years from the Russians. And the Russians are gladly, not gladly, every few weeks they jump out of the grain deal, because I'm sure some a political group points this out in Russia, that why are we, kowtowing to,
Why
to the
are we
Turkish needs?
undoing what we spent 300 years doing?
That's right. That's exactly right. And I think it's pretty clear. And I would say as a new norm, and I think this is a big deal here, as a new norm, Turkey as a NATO country and Turkey as a naval power has always had a much more limited footprint and also sort of regional context that they've operated in. That's been expanding. That was expanding anyway, especially their deals they've been attempting to do with Libya, with Israel, for natural gas, for drilling, the stepping into sort of Greek or contested areas. So there was a natural evolution of the Turkish Navy into a more, let's say, moderate zone Navy. The rest of this decade, and some of their buying and construction of corvettes, basically, focused on that. I would argue if this plays its hand out, I think Turkey will use this as an opportunity to substantially develop their Navy into I'd say a moderately large naval Mediterranean and Black Sea and probably Adriatic power. And you're going to probably see, I would pay attention in the next year to basically RFPs, requests for proposals from Turkey for small diesel submarines, frigates, that standard sort of upgrading your Navy up that food chain. And I would completely expect that from the Turks. And so, when it comes to the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict, obviously Russia does not want to leverage forces across the Caucasus and Central Asia and or proxies, while at the same time they need those in Ukraine. So the sooner they can bring down any of those conflictual areas, which has always been, Nagorno-Karabakh, and then sort of the semi-incompetence of the Armenians in the last 2 years to take on Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, and then, feeling kind of the whirlwind from the Azerbaijanis, supported by the Turkey and the Turkish proxy, especially the drone war, which I would argue that was the drone war that sort of triggered everything we're doing with drones right now. And I know you and I talked about that about a year ago, Richard. So about a year ago.
Unfortunately, the recording has been lost, so we should probably do that again.
We should probably redo that one again. Actually,
we'll add it to our Middle Eastern history series when we
That's
finally
right.
get to the.
It's not like we don't have any space for Middle Eastern history. But so this speaks to how the Russians are attempting to context switch. Which is in a big picture when you think about how large powers, whether it's the Chinese, the US, the Russians, Europeans, will often talk about being able to maintain two large conflict zones at the same time. The reality is that's always really, been a sort of a fool's errand. It's never been very sustainable. And you're seeing this play out with the Russians really anywhere else that they're engaged with, whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in Kazakhstan, obviously whether it's in Armenia, and anywhere else that is going to pop up in Central Asia, which pretty much on an annual basis, you count on one of them having some fun. And
not Turkmenistan, no fun there.
Exactly. And understand the reason this is important is, we'll talk about this at a later date, but the CSTO, which is the Russian ex-Soviet version of NATO, is their security treaty. And so there's some dependencies there. And right now the Russians are leveraging those dependencies, i.e. send us your people so that they can, die for the great, Russia, and we'll, I don't know, send you back.
I was going to say, based
potash and, and some grain.
What I was actually saying is that this might well be the death of the CSTO, because Kazakhstan has already refused to send its young boys to the meat grinder. Now I've got two questions, so let's address the first one. Now does this war really change the situation of the Balkan states that are trying to join the European Union? Serbia especially, right? Because Serbia has that special relationship with Russia.
I think it's a great question with Serbia. I really do. I think the rest of the Balkans, it makes it pretty clear what side they want to be on or they have to be on. And I think that, is sort of synthesize their alignment. And I would say their European Union ascension, which to be honest is more important than their NATO ascension for their day-to-day living, being in the EU and getting the modern EU benefits package, basically, which is all of the sort of leveling up. Changes. Yeah, exactly. Is going to be a substantial benefit to all those states. And I think, excuse me, I think in Serbia, you're having this collision of, where are we going, right? Which direction? Are we going to basically sit neutral or are we pivoting to the EU? And Serbia has traditionally been sort of the most developed part of the Balkans, but I would argue they run the risk very quickly, meaning this next decade, if they don't really adjust their positions, of losing, a huge amount of this ascension funding, which, is billions, right? I mean, I would argue over time, it's tens of billions. And really, when you count outside investors and internal investors, bonds, everything you generate, it's really hundreds of billions. And so, this isn't, this is really sort of whether Serbia makes the decision to become a modern, developed European state, or whether it sort of sits in this, kind of gray, underdeveloped place while a state like Croatia or Slovenia.
And so does this play into the EIP vision that Macron has?
Yeah, I mean, to give Macron and France, but I would say Macron especially credit on this is that he's really been the only leader anywhere that has been prioritizing sort of Balkan needs and priorities in terms of becoming not just in becoming European, but becoming part of the modern, developed, integrated, trade-centric, technology-centric, world. And you sadly, you'd never had that out of the Italians. And including, we're not talking about even Maloney now, we're talking in the last, 15, 20 years, they haven't, and they're right across the Adriatic, right? So, I would say the French definitely get the super gold star when it comes to supporting, the needs and the desires. And I would say the priorities of the Balkans. And I've always felt the Balkans are this incredible area as a resource across Europe that should be tied in. When it comes to all the benefits, all the talent they have, all the incredible landscape, ecology, obviously incredible tourism. I mean, everything that's there. Obviously, the politics are difficult or have been difficult. I think, interestingly, with the war in Ukraine, I think the politics get a lot simpler, actually, because it's a forcing function internal to each of those states. How serious do they want to be about being part of the future of Europe?
Right. No, and in Serbia in particular, as Chris points out, there is a strong Russian or pro-Russian component because of Serbia's long history. So it'll be difficult for the leadership, which is more pro-EU, to reconcile that with the
That's right. And what's going to be interesting is if there is at some point the test case in this is that while that dissension happens, can either neutral plus or pro-EU governments still get elected? If that happens, then the momentum will maybe still be we'll still have a big cultural minority support of Russia, but the direction of Serbia will be, maybe it'll be half a step slower than the other Balkan states, but it'll still be in that pathway, which if I'm predicting, that's probably where I'm leaning, because the business interest in the future of the business interest in Serbia is not with Russia, especially now, given the sanctions regime. It doesn't make any sense just at a practical level. I mean, if you're a manufacturer in Serbia right now, you're not manufacturing anything for Russia. It doesn't make sense. You're going to be manufacturing. You're cutting deals with Turkey. You're cutting deals with obviously with France or Germany
Well, Aaron,
or
actually,
other.
we actually have a Serbian on the line. Vuk is
Great,
willing to talk to us. So, Vuk, what are
wonderful.
your sort of thoughts on this?
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, I'm coming back from work, so I just joined kind of ad hoc.
Don't worry, it's like a BBC thing. It's kind of cool, actually.
I know it's fine. So I find it quite funny the way that we're commenting in kind of a third person in the Balkans, but in the recent times, I think that the population in Serbia, as far as I know them, they're quite divided. Right, I think that the current leadership, which has been on for about 10 years, maybe more, Vucic, he's been very good at pulling kind of the Russia, USA, China card, in the sense that he's trying to be like Giovanni Giolitti, or if you think about Mussolini of Serbia, to me.
Yep.
In the sense that Serbia quite recently signed an agreement with Albania to recognize Kosovo and Washington. So there was a huge step. Those are when Trump was in office, and there was a huge step forward to kind of going towards a more neutral ground with the rest of the Balkan states. But then, when the war in Ukraine started, they were kind of neutral. They did not want to take sides. So I would argue that the population was largely pro-Russian, but it did not. The popular opinion did not impact politics that much because I think the politicians themselves know in Serbia that nothing comes good out of an alliance with Russia. But I'm not an expert in Balkan politics. I'm just this kind of what my observations were. And yeah, hopefully that makes some sense.
Oh, that's great points. I mean, those are great points, and you're on the ground, which is great. So
yeah.
All right.
Well, so thank you, Owen
Yeah.
Bennett Jones.
Yeah, exactly. No, so that's what I hope should take care of the Balkans. Now that
and by the way, Vuk, in the future, but if you want to join us on other conversations when we go over the Balkans, please, feel free. We'd love to have you because we really enjoy having people who are from a place and are highly aware and also just bring what it's really like and where the population is feeling the shifts and how people are coexisting in that politics.
Yeah. So another question is that Putin is threatening to retaliate with maritime activity. How does this affect, for example, the transmission of data over undersea cables? How does that affect naval engagement between submarines? Can you sort of talk about the maritime?
I mean, it's this larger. I would almost call it. It's taking what is on land and traditionally terrestrial sort of asymmetrical operations or hybrid warfare, as people have called it, or gray zone war, and bringing it to the maritime. Now, I would argue that is A, more difficult, B, attribution tends to come eventually because the forensics, water is hard, difficult, oceans are big. Being able to do things that have substantial impacts tends to leave a big signature. It's not behind the scenes sort of sneaky peeky type operations. So I think that's difficult. I also believe, and this is I think sort of fundamental, is that there is a very unique, and this as a lawyer, set of maritime law that is larger and longer in many ways than traditional state constitutional law, and definitely less flexible. And so if Russia wants to finish digging a hole that it's in and go all the way to the core, I would say running a whole bunch of maritime operations against a huge amount, because remember, most people don't realize when you have a ship that's used for something, or you have a maritime facility, It's flagging, it's insurance, it's ownership, its crew, the effects of it, meaning the different property that's being transferred, typically is just so multifaceted. It's basically the most global thing we have. And so the moment, you press your finger on that scale against that, I mean, you're creating so many counterparty risks that, I think Russia would find itself in a very, uncomfortable position with a lot of actors that it has relationships with, because in the end, if China in the end is responsible for roughly 10% of global trade in all directions, no matter what it is, you could make a pretty decent calculation that you're going to find some Chinese counterparty to something that's independent of Chinese investment. So, or others, India might be 3% of that now, or other, so pretty soon all of these sort of non-aligned parties that Russia has a coaxial agreement with might be 20% of all trade and finance out there. And you start, sinking a random freighter or a cargo ship, or, basically blowing tires out of different operations, you're going to start impacting that. And my guess is those state parties, state-owned companies, those insurance companies aren't going to be giving Russia gratis on those costs, because those costs are going to have to get incurred. So I think that could be one of the larger mistakes, almost as big as invading Ukraine, if the Russians really did a massive maritime hybrid warfare campaign. And cutting undersea cables, well, number one, there's a hell of a lot of undersea cables, right? It's not 1990.
Yeah.
So there tends to be a tremendous amount of redundancy. That doesn't mean that the capacity won't go down, but you'll have a lot of redundant fiber out there and undersea cables out there. But also at that point, you would deal with, I think, the finishing of sanctions if the Russians really began a large-scale maritime campaign, basically.
Yeah, I agree. There was a comment here about if there are any treaties the EU and the Russians have signed regarding the seas. It's usually not done bilaterally when it comes to
That's
the
right.
seas. It's usually their long-standing conventions. Probably
right.
the most because most of these conventions are unwritten. These are just behaviors that have sort of gone on for a while.
Hundreds of years in many
Yeah,
cases.
I was going to say, but probably the biggest written version is UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention of the Laws of the Sea.
Yep.
There are also a number of exclusive economic zone regulations and things like that. And as Chris points out in the comments, if you do something at sea, and it sort of echoes what you said, Aaron, if you do something at sea, it's quite noticeable. Nord Stream is a perfect example here. That not many people have the ability to project power onto the sea.
That's
and
right.
when you do, the fingerprints are much easier to detect.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's
of
impossible to do something on the sea at any scale and not be a medium to
power,
large
yeah.
state actor. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just the amount of resources you need to be effective at having a gray zone attack is pretty substantial.
Yeah. So walk me
Yep.
through, because it seems like you want to talk about the casualties in the last month or so.
Yeah. So, you have to take these. I don't believe you take these with a grain of salt, but I think you take them with the whole spice cabinet. And so that's somewhere between a grain of salt and hard attribution. I tend to, if you've seen any of the other presentations I've done with Richard, I tend to sort of at least double the Ukrainian losses. That seems to be fair on a regular basis. And I tended to align the total casualties in Ukraine with the total casualties in Russia. That doesn't mean necessarily military casualties too. That will mean maybe tens of thousands of civilian casualties. But given the way the Ukrainians are being restocked and resupplied, and it's an existential fight, their casualties have not been as meaningful. I would say their losses, have been marginal relative to how much they've been restocked. I think the Russian casualties and their stocks have been pretty substantial.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's a point that's worth sort of spending a few seconds on,
yeah,
is that when it comes to what Ukraine is losing because of the military commitments from the United States, from Sweden, from Poland, from the United Kingdom, the Ukrainians are able to replace what they've lost,
that's
and the
right.
Russians simply don't have a source that's making military equipment that they can use
That's right.
besides their own factories, and their factories are woefully understaffed.
That's right. And I think, there's almost two ways to look at the Ukrainian casualties. There is a set of 2014 and beyond developed forces, right? They were trained and developed the big part by the U.S. and NATO and themselves. And then there's a whole large sort of volunteer territorial force, which was a little more of a grab bag, right? People who were police or maybe ex-military, people who could basically man fixed fighting positions, right? You're not, generally speaking, going down to your local grocery store, your local Tesco, and grabbing 40 people and saying, hey, let's go on a maneuver operation. People generally don't know how to do that. Just like if you took a complex maritime contract and walked into a Tesco, you're pretty unlikely to get one written. So those type of people will be in territorial forces, which is pretty much proximate to where they are, because they'll know their backyard better than anybody else. They'll have a small group of more senior advisors, more capable advisors who will advise them to create a protected defensive position. Now, since the war began, there's been a massive shift in the training and development of Ukrainian forces. At this point, hundreds of thousands have gone through what I would say would be at least marginal training, a week or two, and then a version of the same thing once they got to their fixed fighting positions. One advantage in territorial forces is it's their backyard. So you could rotate on a pretty regular basis, 5 or 10% of people off the line and take them to, available area and begin small unit training, for a week or two at a time, and keep rotating. And if you have that type of operating rhythm over, months and quarters, you can substantially upgrade those territorial forces. And then as you have more capable fires, artillery, mortar fires, zoned in fires, then you can start even moving some of those the more capable territorial trained forces out of the territorial guard and moving them into your regular conventional forces. And so that's something that I think the Ukrainians have done pretty effectively. The Russians are on the other side of this whole equation, basically. I think now the Russians are finally waking up to the amount of emphasis they're going to have to put on troop and unit training. So they're really rebuilding the Russian military and army as we speak, while they're fighting the Ukrainians. Very similar to what happened with the U.S. in Iraq, actually. But the scale is different, right? The scale of who's fighting them is probably an order of magnitude greater, really, to be honest, or at least in conventional forces. In asymmetrical forces, the Ukrainians have not yet shown to be focused on asymmetrical warfare. I think it's primarily from pressure internal to Ukraine and from the outside. Nobody wants to see Ukraine become Syria at this point.
Yeah, I was going to say we might want to clarify what you mean by when you say asymmetrical warfare.
Yeah.
Is that Ukraine is not sending out, for want of a better term, militant groups
right.
that are sort of working outside of the government, targeting
That's
either
right.
civilian facilities or military facilities with bombings, things like you would see in Syria, for example, between the different militia groups.
And it's not that they don't have capability at this point. I would say they have capability coming out of their ears. It's that they've been able to contain it both in their command and control, their security infrastructure, which I would say is one of the more impressive things, is that you really not seen too many out of area operations. It's obvious there have been some out of area operations that aren't reported, but they've been contained to the point that the Russians have not felt the need so far to counter those out of area operations. My sense is that there is a status quo ante when it comes to this. So the Russians have been pretty clear that if there's out of area operations, they're going to counter in place X. My sense of place X is Poland. I think Poland is the logical place. that if the Russians were going to send a signal because Ukraine or somebody else did operations in Russia, I think the Russians would counter with, probably standoff strikes at some depot, to send the signal. And so far they haven't done that. Or if they have, it's not been reported. It's been very contained. So
yeah, people have to remember that Russia and Poland do share a border.
Big one.
Yeah,
so,
it's the border on the Baltic.
That's right.
So there's that. I also wanted to move on to this.
This is a big deal.
Page.
I think this aid package phase we're in, which really started in September during the counteroffensive that the Ukrainians have, but really amped up in October. And I think this is a byproduct of the indiscriminate attacks that the Russians have been launching. The Russians, basically the Ukrainians have done a fairly effective job with their existing air defenses to protect their military. They made a bet, right? They have X number of air defense systems, and they have Y number of key source targets that the Russians would want to knock out, and the Ukrainians have done a pretty effective job in containing those, either through dispersion, which is typically the number one way you do it, is you spread stuff out a lot, which means you don't need a lot of air defense. You can just spread it out, or where they can't spread it out, they put lots of redundant air defense systems. Now the Russians, having figured this out, basically have gone back to sort of a Syrian playbook, which is to just smash the hell out of the civilian population, which they've launched, substantial attacks. I would say hundreds, if not probably close to 1,000. And that triggered an air defense cycle out of the Allies, which the Ukrainians have been wanting for 6 months, really, to be honest, and they should have had it. But that's where we're at now, which I think over the next quarter, the way the Ukrainians have gotten everything else, whether it's manpads or anti-tank missiles, they're going to get air defense systems. Now, the difference is air defense systems don't stand alone, right? They're integrated into all types of other fire control systems, into ISR systems, basically intelligence,
which was sort of leading me to the question of how do they integrate all these different things from all these different countries?
Yeah. So they're running into, phase one, the Ukrainians are smart people phase has worked out really well, because they got their hackers, they got their people who can, glueware things together. They hack these things to make them more effective. You're now going to get to this more industrialized phase of these systems, where you'd really need people coming back to NATO countries, taking these courses, or these courses being taught at forward bases, maybe shortened. But, at the end of the day, when you have when you look at the end-to-end training to build an air defense system as being maybe 5 years, when you count all the parties that would be involved, and maybe you could normally shorten that to 3 years, 2 years, 2.5, if you kind of just hacked it up. Shortening that to 2 weeks isn't making you an air defense system. I mean, it's putting systems online. It's saying it's like a movie. We see the green, we see the red, we fire at it, but that's really not how air defense systems work anymore, right? They're really layered systems, and all those layers require enormous coordination, and each of those layers becomes separate systems, separate skill sets, separate commands. And so there is almost a corporate friction level of integration that the Ukrainians are now going to start having to deal with, which is going to be a test for them. Are they going to stay modular and smaller, but then take some more risks? Because that's what this boils down to, is risks. I mean, the Israelis have arguably the most sophisticated air defense system in the world, with the dome systems, which aren't just on land, right? They're on land, air, and sea now. So Dome X is what some call them. And arguably, that's a whole nother part of the IDF at this point, or it's going to become part of its own little world. And, it's 99% of these people would be the nerds in high school that are going to work in that, right? They're not going to be big, tough guy, gal type, MMA fighter types, right? They're going to be nerds, because that's what this stuff is. It's computer programming and systems integration and testing and, logistics and planning and operations, all that stuff. So that's going to be a very big hurdle for the Ukrainians to really, kind of shift to. And one last thing on that prior slide, if you want to go back just for a quick second here. So we've continued to send more and more of in the West for both NATO and the US, traditional forces, heavy weapon systems. We are doing some proactive things, like sending enormous amounts of winter uniforms. You can laugh about that. That's Canadians' sort of contribution. Fine, that's worth the laugh. The Canadians should be doing more on other things. I would say if there's a superpower of winter gear, the Canadians are right up there, especially given that it's 35 million people in the country, right? So, their ability to stock up a million person army in Ukraine with full winter uniforms is a big deal. That's a very big deal because, you're talking about a 3-4 plus month heavy winter and the potential, which, traditionally speaking, you don't see large counteroffensives in the winter. I have a 50-50 bet the Ukrainians are going to do a large set of probes. And if viable, they will sort of walk themselves into a counteroffensive if the Russians aren't prepared. And I think that's a 50-50 option now. And then the other thing that's really important here is the Germans. The old saying, better late than never, but they're definitely starting to bring the heavier equipment, the howitzers, the MRLS systems. And by the way, the Germans have, if not the best howitzer system in the world, right up there. It's a phenomenal system. And if the challenge you have in the Germans is that 9 out of 10, probably more like 19 out of 20 of those are made for foreign armies. So what's going to happen is they're going to have to redirect those. And given how bureaucratically awesome and administrative Germany is, the time that will take
probably
to redirect those contracts, it might be faster to just have, what do you call Ramazal, set up a plant in Ukraine and just build them there. But on the other hand, on the U.S. side, we're walking our way to tanks. So nobody's talking about this. This is the big deal in the end. The Ukrainians want tanks, want heavy vehicles. They understand they cannot do large-scale maneuver warfare, heavy combined arms, without tanks and armored vehicles. And getting U.S. Bradleys, which are reserved. So the U.S. Has roughly 4,000 plus Abrams tanks, about 2,800, 3,000 Bradley fighting vehicles. About a third of those are original class ones that were made in the 80s and 90s and lightly upgraded. And those are ones that are going to be retired anyways. I believe eventually those are the ones we're going to send them. The sooner, the better. NATO has its own hodgepodge collection that's very similar, but it's obviously, a whole bunch of EU and NATO countries that have to get out of their own way to do that. But if those large armaments can get to Ukraine, or when those do, then the final phases of the Ukrainian war, I think, begin actually at that point. I think the only missing pieces at that point are aircraft, which I think is next after this. So at this point, it's everybody getting ready to start sending heavy armored vehicles, probably the next 6 months. And then after that, it shifts to aircraft, which I believe will be assault helicopters. The U.S. has over 1,000 H-1 Cobras that are in inventory now because the Marine Corps has switched over to Apaches like the Army. So if the Ukrainians my belief is the Ukrainians could be trained up pretty much in 90 days on Cobras. You would have a Cobra battalion coming off the line probably every couple months. And if you combine that with heavy armored vehicles, this war is going to change pretty dramatically. And I believe that's where this is all leaning to next spring and summer, assuming there's not a major Russian collapse going forward.
All right. We're at 12 o'clock,
Yeah.
but I think that we're really enjoying this Ukraine discussion. We're
Yeah,
getting a lot
yeah,
of
let's
comments
keep
in the
going.
chat, so let's just keep going.
Because the EU defense is we're gonna back our way into that anyway, so that's okay. We could do that one in another few weeks. So, so this is their seemingly final senior commander they've gotten to. I mean, look, one thing that's pretty clear. The U.S. had this same challenge, not quite to the same extreme. I mean, a little bit in the first few months, but you've seen this in other large optional war contexts where the assaulting or aggressor will launch a whole bunch of fronts, a whole bunch of thrusts, and a whole bunch of sort of separate commands. And the Russians took that doctrine of, sort of optional war mismanagement and kind of made it a little biblical, right? They had, somewhere between 8 and 12 separate commanders at the start of the war. And they've been slowly consolidating this down to, we think right now, one final commander. And Surovikin is, he was a supreme commander in Syria, and so he was responsible for employing pretty much all those tactics and supporting the Assad regime on the battlefield and integrating into the Syrian forces, which I think is something important to understand, is that there is a lot of segregation of commands in the Russian force structure. I mean, that's just sort of built into how the Russians are, and it's the separate military districts. This goes back to, Stalin, Khrushchev. It goes back to it really goes back to preventing someone of substantial distinction like Zhukov from ever becoming a supreme Soviet leader. And because they have such a substantial amount of the army under their command. And so what'll be interesting to see is how much leeway, freedom does he have to integrate? Because we're now talking about integrating Russian forces on Russian territory, not Russian forces on Syrian territory, or Russian forces in Central Asia getting ready to deploy to Syria. So this type of integration would occur on Russian territory, and then obviously, in the fight in Ukraine. And given the large-scale mobilization that Russia's been conducting, which at this point, the initial mobilization seems to have been about 80, 90,000, according to what the Russians said, based on the 300,000 target. But it also seems that they have these nonlinear actors, the Wagner group, Kadyrov, who, by the way, was just promoted to Colonel General. I mean, it sounds kind of Mel Brooks-like, but I would not underestimate that, to be honest, because I think what's happening is that they're down to sort of two commands. They're down to the traditional heavy Russian command, and they're down to these other forces commands, which are basically chunks of the Donbas forces, Kurdyov's kind of the Transcaucasus and volunteer forces, which is, I kind of call that the Borat army at this point, and then the Wagner group, which the Wagner group is very serious, because I think the one advantage the Wagner group has is they've got a lot of ground time. They got ground time for over a decade in conflicts, really 15 years. In some ways, that's what they were built for, as a deniable proxy. And they're basically been given the penal system has been turned over to them to, grab X. My guess is they're going to grab 1,000 people a week. It's sort of my guess. And of all of the groups that could actually provide training that would be effective, the Wagner is going to be the most effective, because they wound up doing live fire training with basically Syrians. for several years. So I think folding in the Wagner and the sort of, Borat forces is going to be the interesting dimension here, especially eventually as you mobilize at a large scale. The challenge the Russians are going to run into at a certain point is they're going to look eventually like the Ukrainians did in February and March. They're going to actually have a big sitting army, and then they're going to be struggling to actually logistically man that army. I think in some ways they're getting this backwards. They're focusing on manpower right now, and they should be focused on the fight of logistics. They have enough artillery that makes this difficult for the Ukrainians to dislodge them in the next 6-9 months. And because basically the West is, going very slow in supporting the Ukrainians to have a devastating set of outcomes on the battlefield. So if the Russians were smart, they would be focusing on all their logistics right now. But they're doing the exact opposite. They're focusing on all their manpower. So they run the risk of sitting there with 500,000 people who don't have the stock they need to fight more than 50,000 or 100,000 at a time, which is sort of where Ukraine was, in March and April. And I think that's sort of a fait accompli at this point. And when that happens, you're going to look at them having, and this is going to be the test. Does that happen at the time that the Ukrainians are structured in a way that they can do large-scale maneuver war? If that happens, then the Russians lose. I think that's this test we're going to find out next spring and summer, basically.
And
this goes
like
into
here
that.
We're looking at the Iranian contribution to the war.
That's right, which is its own challenge. Which right now the happiest country, actually three happiest countries in the world to this are Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel. If anything, they should set up a purchase order and accounts payable office so that they could help the Iranians get as much stuff over to Russia as possible, which is going to be interesting because what we're going to see now is how much capacity does Iran actually have in their armaments making? Because at a certain point, just like everybody else, they're going to have to take out a stock. And their major stocks are obviously to protect themselves against regional actors. And then I would say on the small arms, medium arms side, it's going to be everything they've supplied Lebanon, Hezbollah, especially over the last couple decades. And so this will be an interesting test to see how far you can go, because if the Russians drain the drone stock out of the Iranians, which it seems like that's what they want to do, then the Iranians are going to be left in a position where they're going to, whatever their internal manufacturing capability is, which, typically it's not World War II, and it's not Detroit World War II, where, you're running, 8 lines a day, 24 hours a day, and building B-29 bombers every, 12 minutes or whatever, right? So, most of these types of armament makers in the whole world really kind of follow very similar schedules, right? They're making, if you average it out, they're making 1 drone a day, they're making 2 maybe. Nobody's out there making 15 drones a day. I don't mean the stuff you buy at your local digital store or whatever, or on Amazon to fly around your neighborhood or a park or whatever. I mean military or convertible military civilian grade drones. And I would say the stockpiles of the missiles would be very interesting too, because there is a limit that Iran has to have to maintain some type of regional deterrence, so we're gonna see that also. I think in the traditional stockpiles for artillery and for heavy weapons that are used in traditional Soviet gear, I think the Iranians are going to be able to supply quite a bit. But I don't think that's really the top priority the Russians have right now. They want all this standoff. They want to be able to send missiles. They want to be able to send rockets. They want to be able to send drones. They want to be able to, at this point, attack basically Ukrainian infrastructure, which we haven't really talked about. I think that's where Russia is going to focus its energy on is the infrastructure. I think that's where they have the most bang for the buck. That's what they did in Syria. It was very effective. It was devastating. It was horrible, but it was effective in what they were supporting from a regime standpoint. So knocking out all the water, all the power, waste treatment, basically making life hell.
And it goes back to what we were talking about when we did this Ukraine series, all the way back in February, that what Russia's primary goal seems to be, now that they can't overthrow the Ukrainian government, is to basically put Ukraine in a position where it can't be a regional major player. Right. And so Russia will dominate that area. And if Ukraine has to rebuild all of its equipment from ground zero, that achieves that goal. Now,
and they also know that's going to drive dissension in Western politics, because Ukraine can't finance it itself, right? The West, let's be honest. We're not, Ukraine right now needs about $5 billion a month. I would argue more, because they need to, during a war, you have other stressors in your infrastructure and your people. But at least they need $5 billion a month to support their budget. This is just their regular civilian budget, and which is a lot of money at an individual level, obviously. But when you're looking at Europe, you're looking at the West and the totality of their economies, which collectively, is over 40 trillion. I think GDP, it's the ability to not be able to afford $1 billion a week. I think is sort of an indictment at this point. I get the local politics in this are terrible. The optics don't work because people need stuff wherever they are. But I think Russia's counting on the West struggling to do this. And I would say the rebuilding of Ukraine is going to be $1 trillion event and take decades. And I don't think we fully realize how bad it is until one day this is over, and we really will see how, this will be the closest thing that looks like World War II in terms of decimated cities that we've seen since then, basically.
Yeah. No, another question here is whether Benjamin Netanyahu will take a different position than the previous Israeli government. My intuition is to say no.
Yeah, I don't think so.
And the reason is that first of all, the government that existed before Netanyahu, with the exception of the last 3 or 4 months, which was a caretaker government, and that government happened to be a little bit more left-wing. And by more left-wing, I mean they were dead center.
Yes.
As opposed to center-right or right.
That's right.
But aside from the last few months, the government has been right-wing. It just simply hasn't been individuals. It simply hasn't been Netanyahu himself.
That's right.
And so I don't really see much of a difference in the personality that's going to be playing.
And I think it's very important what's going on with Iran right now, right? Netanyahu, for him to step into this conflict in any way while the Iranians are funneling a whole bunch of resources to Russia, which really means taking resources off the line.
Out of the Middle East, yeah.
Yeah. This would be a monumentally, and by the way, even if he wanted to do it, I think he would get slapped down pretty quickly.
Yeah. No, I think also you have to realize that Israel has to reassess, and it's something that the conservative government in Israel was doing for a while, is that with the Trump and Obama administrations, the United States has been less and less interested in playing referee in the Middle East. And if that's the case, Russia by default becomes the dominant foreign power.
That's right. And then an axis framed of Israel, Turkey, and the Gulf, the GCC, becomes basically, with Egypt, the dominant physics in the Middle East. And that is a counterweight, that's a balance to Russia. And ultimately those states, however, not all pro-American, or they're not all anti-American either. They're in this sort of middle ground, middle plus, let's say. And then on the European side, I would say, they're somewhere in that middle plus zone too. And so I think that's where this aligns. And acting as a counterweight to Russia, and then also China to a lesser degree, I think becomes dominant. And if anything, I see him wanting to maybe take a few regional risks, maybe a little more interaction on the GCC front. Maybe trying to change some of those regional dynamics. Because he's going to want to. I would be shocked if he wants to go down again in 1 to 2 years because his government just is completely ineffectual. I think there's a 50-50 that he's going to tack more to his rhetoric might go more to the ultra right, but I think his policies might tack more to the center right.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also want to stress Israel and Lebanon recently signed a treaty negotiating their maritime boundary.
Big deal.
While that's not a treaty of recognition and it's not a treaty of peace, it definitely could lead to one of the things that, for example, during the Lebanese Civil War, and when we eventually get there in my MENA series, we'll talk about this. Bashir Gemayel actually offered Ariel Sharon, who was a general at the time, a non-aggression pact. And I think that Bibi might actually pursue that with Lebanon, with Iran's influence weakened because of their interactions with Russia. It might be something that the Lebanese might be able to swing.
Yeah, and a big deal in this is going to be Turkey wanting to develop the natural gas fields, and Israel, Turkey creating a sort of boundary relationship. And given that the French and the Israelis have a better relationship than the French and the Turks do, there's a chance. I mean, it's the Middle East, so that's all you get is a chance. There's a chance that they could square that circle or some of that circle. And I think that's the type of focus that they're going to have. It's going to be much more pragmatic politics, maybe not the pragmatic politics that people who are progressive like, or that people want completely, but it's not going to be just bombastic rhetoric, kind of not getting anything done. Because I do think, just like Israel, like most other, states that have elections, there's a time clock on getting some things done. And I think Israel, post-COVID, has an enormous amount of domestic infrastructure. It has to change, and it was not really built for the COVID world. And whether it's debt, whether it's the high cost of living, it's all those pieces. And calling people terrorists 24 hours a day doesn't change the price of milk.
But those were issues back in 2015. You had the Tel Aviv.
True.
You have the Tel Aviv marches. But there's a comment here about if it's discovered that Iran sends missiles to Ukraine, that might change politics. I disagree with that. Unless those missiles are being manned by Iranians based in Ukrainian territory, it doesn't really change the mechanics. The Shahab 3 missile is very similar to low distance Russian ballistic missiles, so it doesn't. It's not special because it's Iranian. It's special if Iran would have control over a new position, which doesn't seem to be at all.
It doesn't make sense, especially with the new. Now, if this was 8 months ago, given the command chaos the Russians had, I would say a 20% chance of that. But given where they've consolidated their command infrastructure, I think you're more likely to see the Russians using all of this to combine the targeting opportunistically of under-defended air defense positions that are military, that are Ukrainian, civilian targets, urban areas, just to try to, the standard fear and scaring of civilian populations, and then a massive targeting of Ukrainian infrastructure, water dikes, reservoirs, energy, sanitation, everything that makes a civilization. I think they're gonna go hard at this through the winter. I think their bet is, I think that's one of the only ones they think they have, is to do as much damage as they can while the winter is happening, while there's inflation in the West, while there's enough political dissension in the West, and somehow Ukrainians say, "Oh shucks, my deeper inner mother Russia. That's who I long for." And I don't really believe they believe that either. But I think they believe that could start to wane Ukrainian support, and then that triggers this parallel sort of peace initiatives in the back of their mind, which is obviously Crimea, and whatever defendable positions they think they have in Donbas, which is basically, half of it maybe. And I think that's sort of what their bet is right now. They've had a huge amount of, they've launched a huge amount of their ballistic and cruise missile systems. They, like most military defense contractors in the world, they don't build as much for themselves as they do for others. And in their case, even more. So they've had to redirect all those other shipments, which they've done. So, odds are if you're under contract to get something from Russia, that's not happening. And, you're going to get it from somebody else. And you're probably not calling Iran either, or North Korea, or a whole bunch of others. And so my sense is all of the manufacturing in the world right now is getting directed towards this conflict. If I say all of it, I'd probably say 70% of it, 70% of net new is getting directed, which over time is going to be a governor of the degree of intensity in this conflict. There's a bunch of stuff happening, and I want to give all the credit to Kings and Generals, which we didn't do at the beginning.
Yeah.
I should have done that. So sorry about that. Kings and Generals, guys. Buy their games, really good games, good strategy games.
I was actually going to say, we had a comment, and so some people may have wondered about it too. UA is a short form of Ukraine. So,
yes,
for example, on the previous, for example, if you look in that upper right-hand slide, perceived threat that might keep UA troops, UA is Ukrainian.
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But yeah, we're really appreciative to Kings and Generals for having put together all of these very good summarizing slides that we can talk about and
exactly.
Go into
and
more
so
detail.
Belarus has always been this, paper tiger, out there. Maybe we have to be honest. They did launch their initial or a big chunk of their initial wave of their assault on Kiev from Belarus. And so I think what's become pretty clear with Belarus is that Belarus is going to be used just as another staging ground for Russian forces. I do not see a large-scale conventional combined arms attack coming from Belarus, given that they can't do that from Donbas. I don't know why they would be able to do that from Belarus. Logistically, that's just more difficult. I do think they're going to be leveraging it as a regional grouping of forces, retraining, rearmament area. And if there is a risk of the spillover effects of this conflict, it will be into Belarus. I've always felt that from the beginning, especially if and when the Russians start launching standoff weapon systems, missile systems from Belarus, the Ukrainians will counter battery attack them. I think that will happen. And the question will be what the escalatory dynamics are of that. How far do the Russians take?
One question I've always had about this is that if the Belarusian military actually gets involved, as opposed to the Russians using Belarus as a place to deploy their own army, is there a possibility of, and the thing that we also need to take into account is that a number of Belarusians who have been anti-government forces within Belarus have fled to Ukraine and are now fighting in the Ukrainian army.
That's right.
Is there a possibility that Ukraine might launch an invasion of Belarus and try to liberate?
I mean, there is. If Ukraine had their druthers, it would rename the whole region. Ukrainian great nation of Eurasia. But I think that's trying to eat the whole whale in one bite. No, the West is not going to support any out-of-state level engagements. This is the one thing I really have believed from the beginning is the West has wanted to maintain this. When I say the words limited war, people often interpret that as not a big, heavy war. It doesn't mean that at all. It's meant in international relations terms.
It's a geographic scope.
It's a geographic scope, exactly. So the West has always focused on this being a limited war, and limited war meaning territorially to Ukraine. And the Russians have, I would say, for the most part, complied in that scope. And now the Russians could choose to create some escalatory dynamics to sort of test out or tease out the Ukrainian response. I believe the Ukrainian response that would be allowed would be very, very surgical, right? It would be very proportional, right? If the Russians launch standoff weapon systems, from Belarus, then the Ukrainians will have counter battery fire, and that's it. They won't send an invasion force. They won't, do special operations. They won't do a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, if there was proportional special operations coming from Russia, from the Russians in Belarus, I think that's where things get pretty gray, pretty quickly. But I think those are special use cases, basically, at this point. I don't, and I do think you brought up an interesting risk, which is Belarusian trained, Ukrainian trained Belarusians who are fighting against the Russians going back home, and bringing the fight to the Belarusian government, the Russians as an asymmetrical force. I think there's a lot. I think we're trying to have a lot of controls. I think the Ukrainians are too, because if there is a shift in the political and escalatory dynamics, it will be seeing Ukraine not as a responsible actor in this and maintaining that responsibility to keep it a limited war.
Yeah.
Whatever the reasons are, no one's going to care. No one's going to care. All they're going to say is people who had connections to Ukraine did X. And that's you're talking about losing, I think, substantial political capital actually around the world. So I think the Ukrainians are pretty aware of this. So far have done obviously a pretty good job.
Yeah, I know. I wanted to address, there's a comment that Afghan soldiers have been fighting on behalf of Russia. To what extent is that accurate? What kind of soldiers is Afghanistan? To what extent are these soldiers fighting? Are they representatives of the Taliban?
I think this is Colonel General Kardashev. I have to properly give him his weighting. This is his Borat army, right? This is his grab bag of anyone that, for whatever reason, do it for a shaheed, do it for a paycheck, do it because of Mother Russia, do it for whatever the reason is, forces that he's developing. And I do think there's a more professionalization that's going to happen of those forces over time. They'll have limits in terms of capability over time. These are small unit, really small to medium unit forces. They've never trained and developed above really a company level. And when you're talking about the types of training, I mean this in the least worst way that sounds, but you're talking about populations that don't have huge literacy rates. So, when you're talking about organizing forces at battalion and regiment level, and also, let's just say, populations that might not have, in terms of fighting forces, the greatest impulse control. So, you're looking at a pretty unique force that is going to be used more like shock troops, small unit, raiding parties, fixed positions, almost in some ways as a replacement of territorial forces. I think that territorial forces with maybe a little more punch to them. But, they don't have experience manning, Iskander missile systems or 152 millimeter Mista batteries. That's not what they're trained in. Could you train them to some degree? Some of them, sure, but that's going to be pretty marginal. And I think a lot of what the Russians need, to be honest, is combined arms. And if they're going to if the Ukrainians are building a combined arms maneuver, three-dimensional fighting force over the next year to take all of Ukraine, the way you're going to stop that is building your own combined arms, air-land battle doctrine Russian version to, basically halt that, right? You're not going to build a whole bunch of Shaheed battalions to go run up against a bunch of steel. That doesn't really work. And so I think that's going to be the limit of most of that. This is the as latest as we have, sort of the situational report in the contested, non-contested areas. I still see the majority of the battle weight is in the south, where basically protecting Crimea and protecting the whole southern oblasts is the center of gravity of the Russian forces. I think it's always been the center of gravity. And the center of gravity, I mean, in that traditional sense, von Clausewitz, for those of you that are familiar with it, for those of you that aren't, it's sort of where the predominance of your political, military, and sort of people will is behind something. And I think the Russians feel a fundamental irredentist, revanchist, cultural, social, historical belief in Crimea, much less political, military, and I'd say civilizational belief in it too, as the Black Sea Fleet. And so I think that's where you're going to see the mass mobilization geared towards. I think that's where the Russians will have the greatest chance of defending. But I also see all that space up in the north, and you're starting to see it in Lindan. In Lindan, which is the central. And just so you know, where you see central, southern, and eastern, these are the military districts. So Russia has, 4 large military districts that they're organized in. They call them area armies, and so they have these separate, and these area armies have their own commanders. So this is some of that command and control unity issue that they've always had, because when you're looking at central and southern and eastern overlapping, each of these are structured a little differently. They have different commands, they have different objectives, so you have coordination problems. And I believe that the Ukrainians have been and will, as time goes on, take advantage of these coordination problems. And a lot of these coordination problems aren't things you can fix, right? You can't pull 2 people together and say coordinate, right? It doesn't work like that, right? People have to practice this. You have to do exercises in coordination. You actually have to plan. You have to supply. All your forces have to train under coordinated, to the point that in NATO and in the United States specifically, there's a term for it. We call it the purple forces, right? Because you put all the colors of all the different branches, uniforms together, it makes purple. As the old saying goes, you take all the colors together, you kind of make purple. And so, that purple has been this 40-year exercise. And I would say in the US, our grade for that fluctuates between C's and B's. That's probably a pretty fair grade. I think in Europe, it's, D's to C's. So if you haven't done this, it's hard. It's extremely hard, because you have each of your forces, each of your branches, each of your separate areas are organized for threats, for conditions, for geography, force composition, structure, everything for different reasons. And now you're putting them together and you say, do coordination. So whereas the Ukrainians don't have that challenge at the end of the day, right? The Ukrainians are building a combined arms from the ground up. Their challenge is getting the supply, getting the training, and basically creating the command environment to get it done. It's a big challenge. It's probably realistically going to take them 6 more months, but that's their true north. And that's their center of gravity. And that's a very hard one to defeat that the Russians have at this point. Basically, the only way the Russians can defeat it is with a better version of it. And so I think that's, in a lot of ways, how you see this area playing out. Now, you're seeing the Ukrainians at this point attacking hard into the Kherson region. Well, Kherson city, Kherson region, right? So they're kind of 2 different things. So there's the region, which everywhere there is a gap. And obviously the amount of artillery that the Russians have formed along this area is astronomical. So this is where the massive amounts of counter battery fire are going, that the Ukrainians are taking out, or attempting to take out. And that's going to be a test if the Ukrainians can attack on the north, or continue attacks on the north. And the only way the Russians have to prevent those attacks from penetrating is to mass artillery. And then the Ukrainians are able to counter battery strike on the Russian artillery in the south. That puts pressures on the Russians to figure out where do they move their artillery. And moving artillery, it's not a video game, right? Moving artillery takes a long time. It takes a long time to figure out where you're going to hold your positions, building the positions, moving the equipment, moving the troops, zeroing everything in, getting your target packages, getting all of your stocks, integrating it all into your existing command. I mean, it's minimum of weeks. And if the Ukrainians are maneuvering on the battlefield, right, that means wherever you're setting up is an old position and you're having to keep moving the position. And that's why if the Ukrainians can build this maneuver set of forces over the next 3, 6, 9 months, it doesn't matter what the artillery positions have that the Russians have at this point will be, because they're going to be able to outmaneuver them over time if they have enough dense forces, meaning tens of thousands in each maneuver thrust. And my sense is the Ukrainians want to try to build 3 to 6 big maneuver thrusts. And if they can do that the next 6 to 12 months, they're going to win the war. I think it's pretty simple.
Now, one thing that I've always wondered is why is there so much pressure on Kherson and not trying to break into Berdyansk and Mariupol to try and break apart the Donbas region from the Crimean resupply?
I mean, so you bring up a couple good fundamental questions here. So I think there's a combination of reasons. One is you have, if there is a freak out from anyone in the world, it's anything to do with nuclear, as we know. And so having large scale kinetic attacks during where there's been medium sized to light kinetic attacks around nuclear plants is not something a lot of people have been excited about for obvious reasons. And so for the Ukrainians to take Mariupol, they're going to have to really punch through a pretty substantial line. And they do run the risk of having basically an inverse development if the Russians can close the line and the Ukrainians can't actually have a broad enough front to have a thrust on, which I do question if they have enough maneuver. And this is why they want tanks. This is why they want modern armored fighting vehicles. And this is where this is all tied together, right? I mean, all these things don't live separately, right? It's sort of like a math problem, really, in a lot of ways. So a lot of what Ukrainians want to do require a lot of things they don't have. And we have been questioning how fast we want to give them these things because we wonder how much do they want to take risks to win various battles and to dig maybe a hole that we aren't ready to deal with, which having, a nuke plant that is having an emergency is probably not something we're trying to factor in right now, which I think is a mistake. I think at this point, what we should factor in the West, I mean, we really should. And the Japanese are experts at this, obviously. And we have, people in the US and people in France that are experts. Those are sort of the 3 big, experts in the world, or sets of experts in the world. We should have a nest team built for an eventuality of a major nuclear plant challenge because the Russians attack, or try to shut it down, or because the Ukrainians overwhelm a particular choke point and the Russians decide to say the hell with it. And we need to send in, thousands of people who know how to try to prevent a nuclear meltdown. I don't have a sense that we're ready for this at all. I have a sense that, I'm sure there's a bunch of people getting paid a whole bunch of money to do a bunch of whiteboards and have a bunch of planning, good contracts for that. But my sense is we're not drilling for this and we don't have a staging unit ready in Poland to go. And I think that's what we need to have ready. We need to be ready for that because I think I give that a 25% eventuality. Just whether it's bad luck, Russians don't care, local commander, wacko, whatever, it could easily happen. And I do think we're the Ukrainians are very aware of our sensitivities in this whole fight, and they understand that anything that goes through a nuclear plant. Now, you can make an argument that, and the Ukrainians are probably trying to make this argument, that they could secure this by taking, these bigger risks. But at this point, I don't think they feel comfortable. We feel comfortable, and I'm sure the Russians have signaled enough that, well, if we're going to lose this anyways, let's see what will happen. And I also do believe, to be very honest, the one advantage to going after Kherson is you do free up that whole Western Odessa Oblast, really puts huge pressure on Sevastopol now. Now the Russians have to make an island choice, which the history of defending an island is not really good, except if you're England, and that's a really big island. But if a small island, that is a problem. So I think if the Ukrainians can dislodge the Russians across that southern area, then that puts all the pressure on really on the Black Sea at that point. So
I love this map, and I love how you neutrally chose to use the Polish language
yes,
as the dominant language of the map.
Yeah.
That way you don't prejudice either the Russian or Ukrainian
A
pronunciation.
little bit on the Ukrainian side, because given the support that the Poles have for Ukraine. But yeah, this gives you a sense of all of the, at least on the Ukrainian side, the unit dynamics that they have, which, the Ukrainians in 9 months have basically organized, I don't know, the third, probably fourth realistically. I would probably say the fourth most mechanized and mobile army in all of NATO, which is, sort of remarkable, actually, to be honest. I don't know if, it speaks to the incredible things you'll do when you're under existential risk, no matter what that thing is. So Ukrainians are, the thing that they've done, which hopefully you can see here, which I think is really the key thing to this, is they've developed what's called a defense in depth. It's layered defense. So every time a unit moves forward, a unit moves in, another unit overlays. So any of you that follow football or soccer, wherever you are, if you understand how good attacking football works, it's very similar, right? You're constantly overlaying your strikers, your midfielders, and if you're really aggressive, some of your defenders. And that's what basically Ukraine is doing. Now, the challenge they have is without the armor they want and need, and I would say without the addition, they really are getting all of the artillery and the counter battery and the air defense. So, but to sustain this with small units, it speaks to the limits of small units actually too, and also non-heavy units, right? So we've had this sense in the last 20 odd years that asymmetrical, lower intensity conflict is the way of the future. That was very true until February 2022. So we're now in this heavy forces world where, to punch through, you need heavy mechanized units, and you need lots of them. And at this point, you need thousands of tanks and armored vehicles. That's what Ukraine needs. And Ukraine, they have a stock of legacy, and they have a stock of acquired Russian, which they're clearly maximizing. But to be very blunt, you've seen the performance on the Russian side of a lot of that equipment, and you're now seeing the Ukrainian version of that performance. And the Ukrainian forces are seemingly more competent with some of that equipment than even the Russians are. It speaks to some fundamental design reality of that equipment, right? A lot of that equipment was never going to get through the Volga Gap. Or actually it was going to get to the full gap and stop, basically, because it was going to have a breakdown or whatever, right? And as a joke, but I mean that sort of in reality, because we're seeing this play out here, right? You're not seeing tank runs of 200 kilometers with Russian tanks. No, that's just not what they're capable of. So next slide here, I think. Yep. And then this is what we see here. And these, by the way, it's important to note that these are much larger units in the South that they've created huge fixed. At the end of the day, Ukraine is still sort of two armies, or maybe three, if you count all of their territorial, interior, northern forces protecting in Belarus and rear forces. There's still sort of three forces at this point. And that's still a fundamental challenge they have. And this is the reality when you're trying to build this modern combined arms force, because they're all developing at different rates and they're also fighting while they're developing. So, that's a fundamental challenge. And one thing you might notice here is that it does not look like the Russians have a huge force. If we had an artillery map here, your mouth would drop in terms of the scale, right? I mean, there's solidly, at least 1,000 pieces of artillery here, and fire weapons, the systems, probably even more. And with the rate of fire that the Russians can sustain, it's not an accident that they were sustaining. I didn't believe it in the beginning, that they were able to sustain 30, 50, 60,000 shells a day. You really haven't seen that output months on end since really World War II. To be honest, you had little periods during the Korean War where you had a little bit of that, but where you had that for months on end, it's sort of remarkable, actually. All right.
So I think, considering that we have about 15 minutes.
Any other questions? Are we going to run any more questions here?
It might just make more sense to, field any more questions.
Yeah. Everyone open up. I know we have a global audience, I think, or a semi-global audience. So
hello, globe.
Yes. Anyone has questions from wherever you're from, or your own, perspective, or if you have, just different broad questions, because it's not a world war, but it's definitely international conflict. And I think that's something we need to fully recognize. Everyone was very lost in the initial phases of this conflict, but as this has gone on 9 months now, it's really truly an international conflict at this point. And I don't see that ceding in any direction. If anything, I see more international actors coming into this conflict, whether just on economic terms, politically, or militarily.
And if anybody wants to speak, you can put up you can raise your hand, and we'll unmute you, and so you can talk.
Yeah. One other thing I think is interesting is China. I seemingly sense China's perspective on this is starting to change. And that they're still a neutral actor, a neutral plus, let's say, on the Russian side, but they're definitely not, flag waving, pounding the table, because this obviously is a additional lever on impacting, the Chinese economy. And, they care about that quite a bit. So, and then I also sense that the larger questions this conflict's generating, especially vis-a-vis Taiwan, is forcing China to reevaluate this. I don't believe China would ever come out. I mean, they might say something here and there, but they would never come out and say that they're disconnecting from Russia on this. But I could see them just sort of gliding to the background, which it sort of seems like they've done already, to be honest.
Yeah, there's sort of a comment. A comment here. So what are your personal opinions on the various possible endings of the war, and where would you like to, if it's too personal of a question, you don't have to answer it.
Yeah, no,
where would you like the war to end?
I mean, where I like it to end is it's pretty irrelevant. Where I see this is really going only two patterns, maybe 2.5. One is we just keep chugging away for the next 9 months. No, everyone said this wouldn't go 9 months. We're already at 9 months. So anyone that says we can't go 18 months, I would just say, look at the last 9 months and do a multiple. So we kind of keep chugging away in that in that pattern, and the Ukrainians build the capacity to basically envelop enough of the north that the Russians have to fall back. And then this just becomes a battle for the south, for basically Crimea. And that then really begins the second phase of this whole war, which I would argue is really then a new version of the 2014 war at that point. And then I think the world and the Ukrainians and the Russians have to make a business decision, because I think that's a very, very tough fight on both sides. I mean, not that this isn't so far, but I think that becomes a 3-4D chess fight, given all the actors involved. And so I think that's one path this has. I think a second path this has is that the Russians have some point a set of collapses, and they basically, in the modern variants, want to sue for peace. And a big chunk of the world says, great, let's start that. And then a lot of the momentum and oxygen come out of the Ukrainian fight, and the Ukrainians then have to press the gas. And now you get some conflict between Ukrainian aspirations, the rest of the world going to peace, and the Russians suing for peace. I give that I think between those first two, I think we're 50-50 in this. I really do. I've always felt it was sort of 50-50. And by the way, this is one of the reasons I just have never bought the whole tactical nuclear weapons thing. It just doesn't make any sense when it comes to these things.
Yeah, speaking of tactical nuclear weapons, we have a question
of
here.
Of course we do.
Tactical
nuclear weapons.
I was going to say, can you just explain the difference between a tactical nuclear weapon and when other people are talking about nuclear weapons?
Sure. Yeah, my joke now is bringing up nuclear weapons in these discussions is like talking about history and any other conversation. And the old joke, eventually you get to Hitler, right? Everybody just pulls that up, right? And so, I was actually surprised we got this far without getting into tactical nuclear weapons. So tactical nuclear weapons or battlefield nuclear weapons are small yield, typically quarter kiloton to 5 kilotons. They were popularized in the 50s and 60s. They became a component of battlefield deterrence in the 70s, especially, where because of the huge advantage that Russians had in Europe, on the battlefield with multi-million man army, and the U.S. and NATO having a substantial limit relative to that, force, then the U.S. deployed basically the Western Alliance, for that matter, UK, French, etc., smaller yield, more tactical nuclear weapons. The Russians, of course, also had their own share of that stock. In the 80s, the U.S., basically in the late 70s, early 80s, the U.S. shut that whole tactical nuclear weapons doctrine down and stayed with strategic nuclear weapons, high yield, and really game theory. And the Russians didn't. So the Russians maintained their tactical nukes and their strategic nukes. And so the discussion has been that the Russians would use tactical nuclear weapons somewhere. Now, a nuclear weapon being deployed of any scale on the battlefield renders that space pretty useless and renders anyone around it pretty useless. And so if your goal is to get anywhere to the other side, it doesn't really work. And if your goal is to ever have anyone on your side there, it doesn't really work. So I guess in some sort of bad TV movie, you could imagine them on their way out while they shut their magical Lord of the Ring gates to mainland Russia. They could drop a whole bunch of tactical nukes. And then
exactly. It strikes me as the kind of thing of like when the Iraqis were retreating from Kuwait and they set fire to Kuwaiti oil fields.
That's right.
Like
That's exactly.
It's that kind of thing. You just ruined the territory, but you don't have it doesn't give you any military victory.
Yeah, and then it flips, I think, a whole universe which we've stayed out of. I think we're keeping a handful of quivers left, including official war crimes, right? I mean, I'm sure at some point, because there's been a lot of investigations, there'll be a more tactical war crimes set of tribunals set up. But if you deployed any type of, tactical, if the Russians deployed any kind of tactical nuclear weapons, I think it becomes pretty clear that then you're looking at regime level, war crimes. I could literally see. I mean, and this is something I've never really thought of till recently. There's never really been the provision to think of a Security Council member being kicked out of the UN. I could conceive of if the Russians deploy tactical nuclear weapons, that the Russians lose their Security Council seat. Actually, I mean, and remember, UN is a body that sort of makes its own rules up. But and I also believe they fundamentally lose China. There's no way that, because remember, the Chinese have a whole different calculus when it comes to nuclear weapons, because they have such an imbalance with the US, and the fact that they don't want the Japanese to modernize any of their ballistic missile capabilities, or capabilities that the Japanese could have. The Russians deploying battlefield nuclear weapons would trigger
entirely.
That blows up 90% of the Chinese 99% of the Chinese calculus that they've been dependent on, which is this gray zone that's allowed the Chinese to keep modernizing the nuclear weapons and saying, "Oh shucks," and then the Japanese just tightening up, and then the North Koreans launching their pre-gaming of getting wasted and launching missiles randomly, and that's this weird balance that exists, which I think is not very healthy, but it exists. The Russians go tactical nukes, everything changes, right? You're looking at a full ballistic missile shield across Asia, without a doubt. The same thing in Europe. I mean, it becomes the largest. I mean, I think it becomes probably one of the largest strategic events in modern political history, really since World War II at that point. And I just don't think the Russians, however they've miscalculated, are that miscalculating. And by the way, the other thing that happens, I do believe, is the gloves come off. I think the risks then that the Ukrainians say, we've held our asymmetrical warfare, for all your reasons, it didn't work, obviously, because we got nuked. So now, we'll unleash the dogs of war. And I really think then you see massive asymmetrical strikes in Russia by Ukrainian forces, by nonlinear, non-state actors.
You're talking about bombs in the Moscow metro kind of thing.
The whole 9 yards. I mean, this thing goes flatline. It really does.
All right. I think because I don't
on that
see...
uplifting note.
Yeah, exactly. On that uplifting note, I look forward to our next discussion in a month. Hopefully, when we return back to the 2008 war in Georgia, turn back the clock to those lovely times when wars were only a few weeks long.
That's right. And this will fold into that, which will be interesting, because I'm going to bring up some interesting pieces where most people viewed this as a single calculation that Putin and the regime made. I'm going to argue this was a calculation to win basically somewhere between their 4th or 5th or 11th or 12th, conflict area that they've had since the Chechen wars, since Putin basically was the, provisional commander of the second Chechen war, second and a half Chechen war. And so as the head of the FSB. So I think this is a linear determinism that the Russians had. And I'm going to bring that up in our next set of conversations, because I think it's pretty important to understand that, versus this whole play on Russian mysticism. And I'm not saying that isn't a byproduct. I'm not saying he doesn't leverage that like any good gaslighting politician does, but I don't say good like they're good morally. I mean, effective. But I think this fits a much more linear determinism that the Russians felt that, well, we can pull this off because we've been 5 for 5, 7 for 7, 10 for 10, whatever the calculus is. And I'll bring all those up because there's quite a few. It's not just Georgia, it's not just Chechnya, it's not just Ukraine 2014, it's not just Estonia.
It's several. Anyway,
quite a few.
goodbye, everybody.
Yep. Bye bye.